All right. So today in this video, I'm going to show you how to use your meta-analyses to answer different research questions. In this example, let's imagine that we're interested in knowing how different risk factors can give rise to burnout. So our research question might be, what are the strongest risk factors that give rise to burnout? Another way of thinking about this is we want to know what types of things predict burnout in terms of someone's job, someone's work experience. What are the things that precede burnout? We might also have another research question, if we want, that looks at the techniques that we can use to prevent burnout. So in this sense, we're looking at an intervention, something that we can implement potentially in our organization, if we're a manager, or something we can try to have implemented if we're just, an employee trying to prevent burnout in ourselves. This is also something that would kind of predict burnout, or perhaps moderate the relationship between burnout and something else, but it's a way of reducing it. So these are our research questions in this example. Let's first learn how to search for articles that would help us answer this research question. To find our articles, as we talked about before, we will go to the JMU library. So to find this, I just type in JMU library, and you can click here. You can also just go right to databases. That's eventually where we're going, is this database tab. And for most of our research questions, because we are interested in organizational issues and management issues, we can go to Business Source Complete as our database. So as we see, this is a database that is used for covering all aspects of business, economics. So you could use this database if you were looking at something more kind of based on finance or accounting as well. In our case, we're probably interested in managerial issues, so it'll work there too. If we're interested in organizational behavior-based research questions, as we are with our burnout question, we may also want to add APA PsycInfo. This is a database that is useful for any sort of psychology-based research, and applied psychology or industrial organizational psychology is an example of a form of psychology that is interested in understanding workplace issues and workplace design. So for us, that works. As we talked about before, you'll be looking to see which of these databases are useful for you, and there's going to be many that aren't. The two that I've indicated here are probably your best bets, but there's also different research guides that you can use as well. So I think there's a research guide that is available for business students that can be used to identify which types of sources might be good. You can always also email the librarian and ask our librarian what types of databases you should use. And you can ask me too. Now we want to find our meta-analysis for our research question. So as you remember, for all of our research questions, we'll want to have at least one meta-analysis that can help us look at the aggregate effect size for the relationship between our two variables. In this case, with this research question, we're actually looking at a host of variables that would predict burnout as our dependent variable. So we want to know which of the independent variables is the strongest predictor of burnout, our dependent variable. So it's not just one independent variable in this case, although you may be interested in one independent variable if you wanted to know how working remotely affects organizational culture. Then working remotely and working from home is your independent variable. Workplace culture is the dependent variable. Those are just two variables in that research question. So in any case, we want to find our meta-analysis, and you could just type in meta-analysis as it's coming up here. But as you'll see, there might also be people who type it in as, or have their paper using terms like meta-analytic instead of meta-analysis. So for this reason, I recommend that you, instead of putting meta-analysis in for your search term, you put in meta-analysis and asterisks. This will give you meta-analytic, and this will give you meta-analysis, because it's creating a stem that then it'll find anything that has that stem and then the derivative endings of the phrase as well. For most, if not all meta-analyses, they will put the term meta-analytic or meta-analysis in their title. So what you'll do to try to narrow your search as sufficiently as possible is put that you want the term meta-analytic or meta-analysis in the title only. The key with searching is that, you're kind of iterating through different types of searches. Maybe you start with a more restrictive search, as we'll kind of do here, and then you realize that there's nothing coming up from that restrictive search. And so then you expand the search terms, make them less restrictive to see if you can find something helpful. In most cases, students are not restrictive enough. So I would recommend starting with a more restrictive search, thinking about your variables, thinking about your Peacock terms. So what's the population of interest? What's the context? All of these things can be used to narrow down your search terms a little bit. So we'll start with meta-analytic here, meta-analysis here, and then we want to look for burnout. Why not start with a more restrictive search and see if we can find a meta-analysis that is specifically about burnout? So something that has burnout in the title, rather than say the abstract, or just if we leave it blank as it is here, any word that any part of the article or the article metadata, like the keywords or anything that the authors supplied about the article, that would come up if we didn't specify where we want these terms to be. So we'll make it more restrictive. We'll put it in the title, see how that goes. We also want to, let me first show you actually, so that we see. If we search these two things, what we'll find is that we actually got a lot of results. We have 140 results. This is probably too many results for us to meaningfully be able to comb through the articles and find one that is more closely related to what we're interested in. Here we see we're looking at interventions to reduce burnout in students. We're not interested in students in our research question. We're interested in employees. We have nursing. Maybe that's too specific. We're not interested in nurses necessarily. We want to know about just generally employees. And so you can see how this kind of population dimension of the Peacock terms has not been accounted for in our search. And therefore, we're getting things that are not related to what we want. Dentists. We don't want dentists. Our research question is not about dentists. It's about just generally employees. Maybe I work in an office setting, and I want to know how to prevent burnout among office workers, not healthcare workers. Mental health, athletes. Okay. So as you can see here, this is too broad. What we can do to add, in this case, context is, and something I would recommend that you guys do for the most part, almost all of you do, is to add the term organization so that you are kind of narrowing it into more organizational behavior type research. And as you can see, there's a lot of words that can come off of organization, organizational, organizing. So I'll do the root here as well. In this case, I don't care if it's in any specific part of my search, as long as they are focused on organizations. And maybe that will help us reduce some of these other terms that are kind of more related to healthcare, for example. I'm also going to add manage, so that we can focus on articles that have been published in management journals. Again, getting out of the healthcare space, trying to get out of the student space or athletes as well. So let's see what happens when I add this. And we have this or operator. That means that anything that has organization and its derivatives, or anything that has manage and its derivatives, either of those will be fine. You'll notice here we have the and operator. That means that the article must have this and either organize or manage in some capacity with those root stem asterisks. Aha. Okay, so this has really reduced the number of articles that we found. We could even add an additional search term if we want. See, we still are getting these kind of nurses, and some of these other things. Some of this looks pretty close, like we see the link between burnout and job performance. That's probably just going to be about employees in general, not necessarily healthcare workers. But in any case, we kind of see that it's getting a little bit more related to what we're interested in. And we also see that we have, this is a conference paper. You don't want to have a conference paper. You only want academic journals. So there are two things that we could do here. One thing we could do is say no nurse. And we'll do the asterisks again, because it could be nursing, it could be nurses, it could be nurse, or doctor, or student, just for good measure. Perfect. So as you see, we're kind of excluding those special populations that are not related to our research question. Don't use research on populations that are not pretty closely related to yours. Most of your research questions will have a lot of articles on them. So make it as specific as possible to your general research question. If you're looking at something organizational, kind of organizational behavior based or management based, you're probably just going to want the population to be general employees, not specific employees, not students, but general employees. That can be the population of interest. Okay, so then the other thing is we do not want to use conference papers. These have not undergone peer review. They have not been critically scrutinized. They have not, some of the conference papers will not make it to publication. So when we see a conference paper, it's not going to be as high of quality as a full-on research paper. So we'll add this additional exclusionary criteria of no conference papers. To be included in our search, it must be an academic journal. We also don't want dissertations. You really, really do not want to have to read a dissertation. They are like 200 pages long and they're full of sadness because some poor grad student had to spend all of their life writing this thing. So they're also not as usually high quality because they have not undergone peer review as well. So don't use the dissertation. All right, so now we see that we have 37 articles that were returned. You should record this and use this as part of your RER write-up. So you'll put it in your table. You'll put that the title, you have TI, parentheses, meta-analytic as the asterisk. So you'll include these exact search terms and put that in the table that you do for your table 1. Okay, so now we need to find something that sounds like it's going to tell us what the predictors are of burnout. Here we have the link between burnout and job performance. In that case, they're putting burnout as an independent variable and job performance as a dependent variable that it's explaining. Burnout is explaining it. The effect of burnout and work attitudes on turnover and tension. Again, here, burnout is the independent variable, turnover and tension is the dependent variable. That's not what we're interested in our research question, but it may be of interest for others who are looking at that relationship. Cognitive function and clinical burnout. That sounds like it might be a special population. Maybe it's some sort of, again, healthcare or mental health or something like that. Maybe we would look back at that, but because we have 37 articles, I'm not going to waste my time on it because it doesn't sound like it's quite the right thing. A meta-analysis of burnout with job demands, resources, and attitudes. That kind of sounds like something I might be interested in. It sounds like we're looking at what types of work characteristics are predictive of burnout. So here we see a meta-analysis was conducted on job demands, resources, and attitudes in the relation to burnout. So we're seeing what is the risk factors here that are giving rise to burnout. Perfect. To get access to this article, we can select JMU Access. And sometimes it asks you to log in using your login credentials that you would use to get into Canvas. You can also log in using the VPN. It just depends on kind of what's going on with your computer and if you have the VPN up and running. But it should be pretty straightforward either direction that you go. If you just click on JMU Access, it may ask you to log in. In my case, it did not. All right. So in order to make sense of this research article, we'll read the abstract and get a sense of, is this what we're looking for? Is this the right type of article for our research question, our PCOC terms? And from this, we know, or I know already, that this article is what we're looking for. We're looking at job demands, resources, and attitudes, and how it affects burnout. They're kind of discussing this theory here. As you start to tug on the thread of what are we looking at? And what is this topic? How do we know what gives rise to burnout? The theories that people use will help explain the mechanism of effect usually. It's kind of a way of describing the inner workings of what might be going on. So that can be helpful for maybe, that could be its own research question. What's the mechanism of effect of this relationship between burnout and these job characteristics? Or it could just be something that you use in your introduction section where you describe the topic. Maybe it's not of interest for you, but it's potentially something I would recommend reading. We know, okay, in the beginning section here, we want to make sure that we have the right terms. We see burnout. They're kind of describing the importance of burnout. This, again, can be helpful for you writing your own paper. You can use similar arguments. You can, when you explain the importance of your topic, you can look at these citations that they used for potentially citations you would want to use in your introduction. So this is backward searching, where you found an article and then you look backwards at the things that it cited itself to help you understand your topic more and write about your topic. Okay, so great. Then we also have this little kind of definition of burnout, a big teaser definition, if you will. It's a little bit shorter than what we'll see as we go down, but it's a psychological phenomena of prolonged exhaustion and disinterest. And this can be, again, used to help define the topic of interest. You'll need to define burnout if this is your research question. Okay. As we go along, we are looking strategically at what's the most important for us in our research question. As we go down, as I mentioned, the theory part of it, you might be interested in looking at to help explain the topic a little bit more. But we are definitely interested in this section where one of our primary variables of interest is being discussed. Here, you'll want to read all of this and look for how they're defining it. Look for any key elements of this idea of burnout. What do we mean when we talk about burnout? We often talk about things that we don't have a precise definition of, going back to our intellectual standards of critical thinking. What does this mean? Can we clarify this idea? As we read, we see that the way that they're measuring burnout is this burnout inventory. Okay, fine. But then with this burnout inventory, we see that there's three kind of main components of burnout: exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishment. This is something that we would want to pay attention to. In our main construct or variable, in this case, burnout, are there subdimensions that we need to be aware of? And in this case, we have exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishment. Here are some further explanations of what these things are. Exhaustion being a feeling of not being able to give any more emotionally because the job has left people with nothing more to give. Depersonalization, which is also called cynicism. That's helpful because when you're looking in your searches, you might see both. And it's good to know that there is interchangeable terms here. You can also use that in your search. So if you wanted to look at depersonalization or cynicism specifically in your search, you would use that or operator to have both of those returned. It's an attempt to distance oneself from the job by actively ignoring the job and client's unique engaging qualities. Reduce personal accomplishment as the third factor of burnout is a decrease in one's perceived professional efficacy. Okay, awesome. Well, not awesome, but that's what we're looking for. And then we see this kind of like stressors, stimuli, which an individual responds with a perception of stress, a type of demand, both in this core theory and play an important role in the burnout process. So that, again, indicates it's an independent variable. These stressors are independent variables. We would read the rest of this as well. And then we see these hypotheses that they're developing. Demands are positively related to the 3 components of burnout. Okay, that's what they're predicting. Then we can go further. We sort of see perceived control and autonomy are negatively related to emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishment. This actually is telling us a potential intervention, right? Because they're saying that perceived control and autonomy are negatively related to these undesirable symptoms, undesirable feelings of burnout. So if we can give people more control and autonomy, maybe we can reduce the feelings of burnout. And this is what they're testing. So this helps us with our second research question. This is these attitudes that they're looking at. These are, they're being described as correlates of burnout. They're probably saying that it's correlates because they don't have evidence of cause and effect. You might be interested in, as a potential additional research question, if you have time, looking at if there actually is a causal relationship between these workplace attitudes like job satisfaction and burnout. But for us, we're not concerned about this part of it at this point in time. We'll just focus on our primary 2 research questions. So it's interesting, but we don't have to include it in our RER. All right. As you read, you'll want to read how they conducted their literature search. Was it clear? Could you replicate this search if you wanted to? Did they explain what types of things they used to exclude the articles in their meta-analysis? And does that align with the Peacock terms in your research question for your RER? So if they said that they only looked at articles that were about nurses, and you're interested in employees in general or employees in a professional context, a workplace, an office context, then this would not be the meta-analysis for you. All right, we keep going. You don't need to worry about meta-analytic strategy so much, but what we do want to see is this table 1. All meta-analyses are going to have a table, something like this, where they explain all the effect sizes between all of the variables that they looked at. And one of these or both of these variables should be in your research question. In this case, we have a host of variables and burnout. It might not be table 1 if they do something else. They do something a little fancy and tricky, but it should be one of the first couple of tables that you see in your article. The way you can tell if this is the table that you want is you see usually a list of variables. They're usually listed in a column like that. And then these other columns indicate that they're telling you a bunch of aggregated effect sizes. K is the number of studies that they aggregated. So this means that they're looking at the relationship in this case between emotional exhaustion as a component of burnout and demands of the job, role ambiguity, role conflict, work overload or workload. Not knowing, so role ambiguity, not knowing what you're supposed to do, role conflict. If I do one thing, then I can't succeed at another. If you remember from our claims adjuster case, some of them mentioned, I feel like if I succeed on one of my metrics that I'm being measured on, then I'm going to fail on the other. So that's what that means. And they should have defined this in other parts of the study. If they haven't, then find studies that can supplement this. Workload, having too much work to do. Okay. So they aggregated 51 individual studies. That's a lot of studies. That's really nice that they have so many individual studies for this relationship. N is the number of people that cumulatively were in these samples. So of the 51 studies, you add them all up, you have 22,000 people. That's a lot of people. Really, really, really big sample size. That's the beauty of meta-analysis. And then you see this mean R. This is the same as rho, which is what we talked about in class. Let's look at this briefly. Rho here, sometimes you have it where it looks like this. Sometimes you have R average. R is the symbol for correlation. So I might say it's an average correlation. R with the line on top of it, that's the line means it's a mean. And in this case, they're just saying mean R. They all are the same thing. It's the average correlation across all 51 studies in this case. And then you see down here, this is the correlation of what they found between role ambiguity and emotional exhaustion. It's 0.26. How do we know if that is something that we would care about or not? Is that a big correlation, a small correlation? Do we feel confident in the effects? As we know from null hypothesis testing and inferential statistics, which is what we are seeing with this meta-analysis, that we want to know if the results that we found from this sample are statistically significantly different from zero, or how likely we think it is that they're statistically significantly different from zero in the population. And that is the whole basis for the idea of the p-value. Is it statistically significant? All right. In this case, we don't have a p-value. You don't see anything here. Sometimes they'll have asterisks, sometimes they won't. In this case, if you are not sure, always look at the note. The note for a table should explain exactly what is in the table. The table itself should be able to be understood with no additional information. So you have an explanation of K, N, okay, R average weighted correlation coefficient. Okay, actually, and so here they have mean rho. That would be a better indicator of what you're looking for, because rho is the weighted correlation coefficient. It's the average correlation coefficient that's corrected for unreliability for both predictor and criterion. So that means that they took out error. So that's actually a better measure. And that's why you see it's higher, because they've removed the statistical noise. You could use either, but just be clear about which one you used. And rho would be better. Okay, so we don't see anywhere that they explain statistical significance. Sometimes they do. Sometimes an asterisk means how statistically significant it is. Sometimes they will have the literal p-value in parentheses next to the correlation. Sometimes it's just as if it's less than 0.05. In this case, we can actually use the confidence interval to help us here. So the confidence interval is the estimation, the lowest range for rho, the average correlation that's corrected for unreliability. It tells us the lowest value that we think it is and the highest value that we think it is within 95% likelihood. So we're 95% confident that our correlation, our average correlation, average rho, is somewhere between 0.29 and 0.34. This does not include zero. If it included zero, it would not be statistically significant. Because it does not include zero, we know that there's an effect here, and we can use this for our interpretation. So here we can guess that the correlation between role ambiguity and emotional exhaustion is somewhere between 0.29 and 0.34. In order to make sense of that, we can then look to these slides that I gave you, but you have this same information in your book. And in fact, I would use your book instead, because the book is more comprehensive. So in the pages that I gave you to read for this module, they have a table in there that explains the different effect sizes of different types of effect sizes, and then how to interpret them. Is it small, medium, or large? For us, we see, okay, a small correlation is 0.10. A medium correlation is 0.30. So something around 0.30 is kind of considered in the medium range. 0.1 and lower is small. 0.5 and higher is large. Let's go back to our findings. We see 95% sure that we're between 0.29 and 0.34. I would interpret that as a medium effect. So there you have it. It's statistically significant. The effect size is medium. And you know that it's a positive relationship. So as role ambiguity increases, emotional exhaustion increases. It's a risk factor for burnout. So that's starting to get you in your answer for your research question. But for our research question, as you'll remember, we want to know what the strongest risk factors are that give rise to burnout. What we can then do is maybe look at, for each of the 3 subcomponents of burnout: emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishment, which of these what are the largest correlations for these 3 subcomponents? So all of the relationships between emotional exhaustion are here. After that, we move to cynicism. So we'll just look at this first third of the table and find which is the largest effect size. We're not interested in, we're actually not interested in attitudes, because these we think are correlates of burnout. These are not something that we're kind of theorizing are potentially giving rise to burnout. Resources, this would be something we would look at for our second research question. And maybe we look at, okay, let's look at demands, work demands, which kind of work demands are the strongest predictors of burnout. And in this case, we see that with emotional exhaustion, the biggest one, or the biggest, actually, so if we look at the corrected correlation row, it changes, and we see role conflict is the strongest predictor of emotional exhaustion. So it's a little bit bigger than workload, but those are pretty close to one another. I would say that the 2 strongest predictors of emotional exhaustion are workload and role conflict. And that would be how I would start to answer that research question. Okay. In your write-up, you would also say what those effect sizes are. You could put in the confidence intervals, you could put in that it's statistically significant, and you would say that it's a medium effect. So here you would have your stats. No, it's actually not medium. It's considered a large effect. This is just taking notes, basically. This is not necessarily how it's going to all look when you're done. So then we do the same thing for cynicism. We can look at these 3 things here. We see they're all kind of the same. They all have a medium-ish, a small to medium effect with cynicism and reduced personal accomplishment. Let's look and see. And again, actually, you want to look at the row, and you see that role conflict's a little bit higher. So that would be the strongest predictor. And then for reduced personal accomplishment, let's look at row, and we see that role ambiguity is the strongest predictor of reduced personal accomplishment. So there's different things that are predicting different types of burnout. And that can be helpful for informing practice in terms of how you would interpret these effect sizes for making recommendations. Assess if your employees are feeling reduced personal accomplishment or if they're feeling cynical or exhausted. There would be different risk factors that would give rise to those symptoms of burnout. And then we can also, for our second research question, we can start to look at these ways of preventing burnout for the 3 different subdimensions as well, see which ones are the most effective. You might include all of these in your write-up for your research question. So you don't have to just pick one or the other. It's up to you what you think is the most useful. In this case, control and autonomy are both kind of the same. And for that, you would want to read, how are they defining control? How are they defining autonomy? And be very specific about how, like the difference between those 2 things when you're writing up your paper. The same over here. We see that it's actually pretty close. They both have a medium effect with reducing cynicism, control, and autonomy. And then for reduced personal accomplishment, same thing. They actually have kind of a similar effect in terms of preventing burnout. And it seems like control and autonomy are most helpful when it comes to reduced personal accomplishment. So these are how you would start to answer your research questions. You would take note of these effect sizes and interpret them by looking at what we talked about in class and interpret them by looking at the book as well. The book is a really, really good resource for you here. And that would be sufficient for your meta-analysis to answer these research questions. And then you could follow up by adding in an experimental study that can detect cause and effect, because most likely here, this is not able to detect cause and effect. These are probably just correlational in nature, maybe just cross-sectional studies that were aggregated. Sometimes they explain whether or not there was the ability to detect causality, and most of the time there isn't. So you can kind of control search, here we go, for cause, and it says limitations. Most of the primary studies included are of cross-sectional design, and this does not allow us to test causal relations. So they addressed that limitation right here. What you could then do as a supplement for your second article that you're using for your research question is find something that might be able to assess causality. Might not exist, but I'm sure there's at least one out there that exists. All right. Hopefully that's helpful and can get you starting your search process and then interpreting it as well.